In Antarctica, scientists were drilling into the ice to study how quickly it was melting due to global warming. While they worked, the ice suddenly cracked and split, sinking the drill they were using. Jason, the operator, managed to escape thanks to the help of Jack and Frank. Quickly, Jack took a huge risk to collect a sample from a very dangerous spot, jumping over the open crevice. But the ice beneath him gave way, causing Jack to fall, leaving him clinging to his axe, which had lodged into the ice. Luckily, Jason and Frank managed to pull him to safety. However, they were shocked to see the massive crack stretching far, hundreds of miles in every direction. Jack eventually presented his findings to world leaders at the United Nations. He warned that global warming wasn't just causing the polar ice to melt, but could also trigger a new ice age, similar to what happened 10,000 years ago. The world leaders were perplexed. Global warming and an ice age seemed like two completely opposing issues. Jack elaborated on his theory. According to him, global warming could disrupt ocean currents, which are critical to the Earth's climate. This imbalance could cause deep temperature changes that might suddenly bring about an ice age, potentially within hundreds or even thousands of years. However, the leaders were still unconvinced. How could they prioritize this issue when efforts to tackle global warming might harm their economies? Meanwhile, in New Delhi, snow fell for the first time, astonishing the locals. After the global warming conference, Jack met Terry, a marine researcher, to discuss his findings and theory. At Terry's research center in Scotland, a buoy reported a drastic temperature drop. Initially, the staff assumed it was just a technical glitch, even after Terry arrived to investigate further. In Japan, massive hailstorms began during a thunderstorm, injuring and even killing many people. Meanwhile, in the United States, Jack's wife, Dr. Lucy, informed him that their son, Sam, would be traveling to New York for a math competition. Jack took Sam to the airport, but their trip was filled with arguments, and Sam left without saying goodbye. Back in space, the astronauts on the International Space Station began observing the formation of an enormous storm system on Earth, signaling a potential catastrophic event. In New York, Sam and his friends, Brian and Laura, rushed toward their competition venue. On the way, they noticed many birds flying frantically and zoo animals displaying strange behavior. Even wolves were trying to escape. Sam felt something was wrong, even though he couldn't figure out what was happening. Meanwhile, Terry grew increasingly worried, especially after hearing reports that Earth's temperatures were dropping drastically. In New York, Sam and his friends grew anxious as they witnessed more bizarre signs from nature. It seemed as though the world was heading toward an unavoidable major disaster. Sam and his friends performed well in the math competition, but one thing was bothering Sam. He felt uneasy watching Laura, who appeared to be flirting with JD, a boy from another school. JD then invited Laura to visit his school, making Sam even more uncomfortable. That night, Terry called Jack to deliver bad news about the buoy reporting drastic temperature drops. Jack's theory was starting to be proven correct. They witnessed the first signs of an ice age beginning to emerge. Jack himself was shocked because he had predicted this would happen over centuries, yet it was occurring much faster than he had anticipated. Terry explained that only her research model could predict such an event. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, a massive storm began devastating the city. A man responsible for monitoring the weather was enjoying a romantic evening with his girlfriend when a phone call from a reporter disrupted the moment. The reporter informed him that a severe hailstorm was hitting Los Angeles. Quickly realizing that a rapidly developing tornado was forming, he immediately notified his boss, who was asleep. Stepping outside to look, his boss witnessed the massive tornado approaching firsthand. Back with Jack and his team, they watched the news as a tornado devastated Los Angeles. The vice president briefed the president, who immediately ordered a suspension of air traffic. Unfortunately, it was too late. 2 planes crashed, leaving Sam and his friends stranded far from home. Jack then elaborated on his theory to his team. Although they were initially skeptical, Terry's findings, which aligned with Jack's model, started to convince them. Jack warned them that the worst was yet to come. The team, consisting of Frank, Jason, and NASA meteorologist Janet, finally began to trust Jack. Jack's boss, Bob, eventually allowed them to use advanced equipment to validate these predictions. They worked tirelessly and discovered that the ice age would begin within 6 to 8 weeks. Jack immediately called Sam, urging him to return home as soon as possible. Meanwhile, JD offered his house as a safe shelter for the group. However, when Jack and Bob tried to convince the vice president with their data, the vice president still didn't take the threat seriously. Jack insisted that a massive evacuation was crucial, especially in the northern regions of the country, yet the vice president remained skeptical. In New York, Sam and his friends visited a museum. There they saw a preserved mammoth, complete with undigested food, as if it had been frozen instantly during the last ice age. Sam grew increasingly certain that the world they knew was about to change. Meanwhile, helicopters were sent to England to carry out rescue rescues amid an extremely cold storm. The royal family was trapped in severe weather, and the helicopter blades froze mid-air, causing a crash. The surviving pilot exited the helicopter, only to freeze to death immediately due to the sub-zero temperatures. Terry sent the data to Jack, who quickly realized that a massive storm was forming over the mainland. It was an unprecedented phenomenon, a highly alarming sign. In New York, a massive flood began to overwhelm the city. Thankfully, Sam and his friends were still safe at JD's house. However, JD grew worried about his separated siblings' safety, so they all decided to look for them. Once they stepped outside, they realized the floodwaters were rising, leaving no way to cross. Despite this, Sam insisted on heading home. At the New York Zoo, zookeepers discovered that wolves had escaped from their enclosure. Meanwhile, people scrambled to find shelter in the public library. However, a homeless man and his dog were denied entry. Sam and his friends, realizing they couldn't make it to the train station, decided to head for the library instead. Along the way, Laura noticed some people trapped in their cars and immediately ran to help them. Unfortunately, her leg was injured in the water, but Laura brushed off the pain and kept moving. Suddenly, a massive tsunami as tall as the Statue of Liberty approached the city. Sam saw Laura still helping others, so he ran toward her, risking his life. He quickly pulled her to safety and brought her inside the library just before the water began to flood in. The group climbed to the second floor to stay safe as the flood engulfed the entire building. Elsewhere, Jack analyzed the latest data and realized the ice age would begin in 10 days, not weeks as he had initially predicted. Jack immediately instructed Terry to evacuate, but Terry, resigned to his fate, chose to stay and urged Jack to focus on saving others. Their phone connection was cut as the storm continued to rage. Jack eventually heard about the destruction in New York and immediately tried to contact Sam. Unfortunately, the phone network was completely down. Sam, who was in the library, used a public phone to call Jack. During the conversation, Jack warned him about the approaching storm, explaining that it would freeze everything instantly. Jack urged Sam to stay indoors no matter what. However, before Sam could respond, their call was cut off as the floodwaters rose higher. Sam struggled to swim back upstairs and finally found Laura, who looked relieved that he had survived. Jack, determined to save his son, decided to head to New York, despite Frank's warnings. Jack began packing his travel gear, while Bob suggested he immediately contact the president to convince him to evacuate as many people as possible. Meanwhile, in New York, heavy snow began to fall. The city's residents were stunned as a massive cargo ship drifted down a flooded street. Jack briefed the president, explaining the imminent ice age. This time, everyone around the conference table listened intently. Jack proposed a large-scale evacuation from the southern United States to Mexico. Although the vice president doubted him, the president ultimately agreed. Jack marked a map showing areas that could still be saved, but admitted it was too late for the northern states. After the meeting, Jack immediately set out to find Sam, while world leaders were still debating their next steps. Eventually, the president decided to follow Jack's plan and ordered a massive evacuation. Back in New York, the floodwaters had frozen over, and people began walking on the icy surface. Inside the library, a debate broke out. Most people decided to head south, even though Sam warned them to stay. Only a few listened to Sam and chose to remain inside the library. Meanwhile, Frank and Jason decided to join Jack on his journey to New York, and the three of them set out together. In Mexico, the border was closed as the country struggled to handle the influx of refugees from the United States. Desperate people began crossing the river and the border illegally, trying to get into the country. In the library, Sam and his friends started building a fire using piles of books to stay warm. They even broke into vending machines to gather food supplies, doing whatever they could to survive the increasingly dire situation. At the hospital, Lucy discovered that all ambulances had already left. Peter, who required a specialized ambulance, couldn't be evacuated. A nurse tried to arrange another ambulance, but Lucy decided to stay with Peter and told the nurse to head south. Meanwhile, Brian managed to build an emergency radio and heard that Europe was already buried under snow. Brian warned Sam that Jack might not make it to New York, but Sam remained confident his father would come. Jack and his team, still trying to head north, got stuck when their vehicle broke down. Forced to continue on foot from Philadelphia, they trudged onward. Those who left the library were struggling to survive in the freezing cold. Unknowingly, Jack's group walked over the glass ceiling of a buried building, and suddenly, the glass shattered. Frank fell, but since he was tied to a rope, he managed to pull Jack and Jason back to the edge. Jack secured himself with an ice axe to prevent further falls, but Frank, realizing the danger, cut the rope to save them. Frank sacrificed himself, plummeting to his death. Now, Only Jack and Jason continued the journey. At the hospital, Lucy was finally able to evacuate Peter after the specialized ambulance arrived. At the library, Laura, still feverish from her leg injury, grew worse. A woman there identified the infection and warned them they'd need penicillin immediately if they wanted to save Laura's life. Meanwhile, astronauts aboard the International Space Station observed the storm consuming nearly half the planet. They sent images to Janet, who analyzed the data and discovered that the storm would hit New York within an hour. Soon after, Jason collapsed from the cold. Jack, determined, pulled him onto a sled and pushed forward to save him. At the same time, Sam decided to retrieve medicine from a cargo ship trapped in the snow, joined by Brian and JD. Inside the ship, they found medical supplies locked in a seemingly inaccessible room. Refusing to give up, Sam climbed outside, broke a window, and unlocked the door from within. They managed to retrieve the desperately needed medicine, but Brian insisted they also gather food supplies. As they headed to the kitchen to look for food, wolves from a nearby zoo that had escaped attacked them. One of the wolves bit JD, but Sam didn't stand by idly. He fought off the wolf and managed to save his friend. The group hid in a room, unsure of how to escape. Thinking quickly, Sam came up with a plan to distract the wolves. He climbed out of a window, luring several wolves to another part of the ship and locking them inside. Afterward, he returned to help Brian and JD, who was struggling to walk. They placed JD on a lifeboat and pulled him back to the library. Meanwhile, Jack and Jason pressed on with their journey, and before their eyes, the storm began to close in, freezing everything in its path. Jack pushed Jason into an air vent for safety before climbing in himself. At the library, Sam and his friends gave Laura the medicine and fed her. They also built a fire using the available books, trying to stay warm as the temperature dropped further and frost began to spread throughout the room. A few hours later, Jason woke up, and Jack told him the storm's eye had passed. They resumed their journey, now only 40 miles away from reaching Sam. Along the way, they saw frozen bodies scattered on the road, which only heightened Jack's sense of urgency. During a brief rest, Jack reassured Jason, who was beginning to panic, explaining that humans had survived such conditions during the last ice age. From space, the astronauts reported that the storm was beginning to clear, revealing land covered in ice. Jack noticed the sunlight breaking through and pushed forward toward New York. They passed a large frozen ship and finally reached the city, now buried under snow. Even the Statue of Liberty was encased in ice. Jack and Jason eventually arrived at the library, frozen but intact. They immediately searched for Sam and the other survivors. When Sam saw his father, he ran to him, hugged him tightly, and thanked him for keeping his promise. Bob quickly informed the president about the survivors in the northern city after receiving a radio signal from Jack. The president, relieved to hear the good news, immediately ordered aid to be sent. He then addressed the public, acknowledging that humanity had exploited the planet's natural resources without considering the consequences. The president also expressed gratitude to Mexico for sheltering refugees during the crisis and mourned the death of the former president, along with all the lives lost in this global disaster. Finally, Lucy and Peter were in a southern hospital, both safe. Thanks to Lucy's relentless efforts, Peter was given a new chance at survival. Search and rescue helicopters began arriving in New York and other northern cities, saving survivors and transporting them to safer locations. Jack, Sam, and the other survivors, including the homeless man and his dog, were eventually evacuated by helicopter. From above, it was clear that many victims were still stranded on rooftops, waiting for help. Meanwhile, astronauts in space observed a transformed Earth, now appearing clearer and with a cleaner atmosphere than it had been in centuries. It was as if the planet had hit the reset button, taking drastic steps to protect its ecosystem from humanity's destruction. This global disaster served as a stark warning, a wake-up call for humanity to preserve natural resources and help the planet recover. Earth is the only home we have, and destroying it is not a wise choice. If we revert to destructive habits and ignore the lessons learned, there may not be a second chance.